couple of months ago, almost 3 months ago now, I sat in a continuing education workshop in which the person who was presenting was talking about some of the differences between the mainstream Protestant church and the non-denominational church that has arisen over the past several decades in our society. And he was offering some of the compare and contrast between the two. But one of the things that he was celebrating is that it doesn't have to be either or, that there are some ways in which we can be both and. And one of the ways that he was speaking that caught my attention was, he said, we can be both the church that is invitational in the way that non-denominational churches so often are, and the church that is nurturing and sustaining throughout the lifelong process of a person's discipleship, as the mainline Protestant denominations do so well. And when he said that, what really caught my attention was that word invitational. Because we so often gravitate toward the importance of hospitality, that we hear an element of hospitality in that word invitation, but invitation also goes along with the part that he was equating with the mainline church, that nurturing a person's faith through a lifelong process of discipleship. And what grabbed me in that moment was a realization that I, as a follower of Jesus, and I, as a pastor of a church, and we as a congregation, and often we as the body of Christ in the world, we approach that idea of lifelong growth as a more organic process. We put the atmosphere in place and we hope that growth will happen. But what if we were more intentional about offering to each other invitations to grow along the way, rather than hoping that it happens? Organically is one word that I used. The one that made me panic was accidentally. What if growth is happening accidentally in our congregation and in congregations like ours because we're not being invitational enough about encouraging each other toward that next step? So it made me think it's important for us to spend some time, maybe especially at the beginning of a new year, to talk about how we want to grow invitationally, both as individuals and as a congregation. So we're going to begin that today by reading a couple of passages from the Gospels, early in the Gospel in Mark's instance, and then a little later in the Gospel in the Luke passage from which we'll read, to hear how Jesus is explicitly and intentionally invitational when he asks people to follow him. First, from Mark's Gospel, chapter 1, let's hear verses 16 through 20. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. He went a little further, and he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in their boat mending the nets. Immediately he called to them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. From Luke's Gospel, let's read from chapter 9, verses 23 through 26. Then Jesus said to them all the people gathered around him, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it. What does it profit them if they gain the whole world but lose or forfeit themselves? Those who are ashamed of me and my words, of them the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels." And we're thankful to God for revealing some of God's nature to us through these words of Scripture. Years ago, and when we flipped over into 2026, I became painfully aware of how many years ago. But years ago, when my ministry was very young, it so happened that I was assigned to a church in Bristol, Virginia, just up the road. And it so happened that one of my friends from college, who was also a young pastor, was assigned to a pair of churches in Bristol just down the road from mine. So my friend Brad called me one day, and in his smaller congregations, he wanted to have a revival renewal series of worship services. So he called me and asked me if I would come over and speak one night at Aldersgate United Methodist Church, a small congregation out on the highway between Bristol and Blountville. So I went to Aldersgate United Methodist Church, and there were fewer people that night in the revival service than there are in this room. And we were reading from one of the call of the first disciple passages from the beginning of one of the Gospels. It may have been the passage in Mark's Gospel we read together today. So at the beginning of that worship service, we set the stage for this service of revival, and then at the sort of the high point, before we even read the gospel lesson, my friend Brad introduced me to the congregation, and I walked up to the front of the congregation and I said, "Hey everyone, follow me." And I stood alone in the hallway like this for a few minutes because no one followed. Now, I felt the need to set that story up by telling you that it happened in Bristol long ago, because I was afraid if I tried that stunt in this room today with people who aren't meeting me for the very first time, and with people who have very honest and who have very helpful and serving hearts, that you might just get up and follow me out of the room. But when no one followed me, I came back in and said, isn't that the remarkable thing about this gospel passage? You wouldn't get up and follow a person you'd never met before, even out of a room. But these four brothers who hear the call of Jesus Christ, encountering him for the first time, drop everything to follow him. Isn't that remarkable? And I know it's easy sometimes for us to read the Gospels in such a way that we look at those disciples and see their flaws. We see the ways in which they're so very human. We hear them arguing over who's supposed to be first in the kingdom. We hear them arguing over whether Peter is the great one or whether John is the great one. At the end of the gospel, Peter even turns to Jesus and says when he's resurrected, "What about him?" Talking about John. So we see their flaws and their brokenness. We see Judas as a betrayer. But I hope today we see the remarkable nature of their faith, that at the outset they're willing to drop everything. We hear about James and John. They leave their father behind. They leave their business behind. They leave their livelihood behind. They may be leaving wives and children behind to follow Jesus. So that's remarkable on the one hand, but we see how difficult it is on the other hand to drop everything to follow Jesus. But we see in this passage that Jesus intentionally invites people to follow him. He uses those precise words to Andrew and to Simon, but also to James and to John, "Follow me." And as we read through the four Gospels, you will find 21 other examples throughout the Gospels in which Jesus specifically speaks those two words, "Follow me." And there are other examples in which people would say to Jesus, "I will follow you, but first." And we hear those other examples in which people say, "How do I follow you?" And Jesus responds to their question. So there are 21 precise examples of "follow me," and there are other examples in which Jesus talks to people and tells them how to be his follower. He is always intentional in his invitation. And it's not just a fisherman. Think about some of the other examples. Jesus says to a hated tax collector, "Follow me." Jesus says to a wealthy man who would have trouble dropping everything because he has a lot, "Follow me." Jesus says to people that the religious leaders of his day would prefer that he not say to them, "Follow me." It's a repeated invitation that Jesus makes throughout the gospel. And they become disciples because that's exactly what the word disciple means, one who follows. So Jesus has probably said to you through the power of the Holy Spirit at one moment or another in your life, "Follow me." And if you didn't hear those exact words, you certainly felt that invitation. Jesus' example is to be intentionally invitational. And we hear in that passage we read together from Luke that Jesus tells us a little bit more about what it means to respond to his intentional invitation. "Let anyone who wants to be my follower take up a cross daily and follow me. Several years ago, even before that Sunday evening that I went to Aldersgate United Methodist Church and offered that invitation, follow me. And remember, my track record's not good because not one person followed. But before that example, I was in school at the Candler School of Theology, learning what it might mean or what it might look like to be a pastor in the United Methodist Church. And 2 years into that educational experience, I was tired. I had gone from kindergarten straight through graduate school, and after all those years of school consecutively, back to back, I was just tired of school. So I went home for spring break during my second year of seminary, knowing that I had a full year of seminary left, and I met with my college chaplain. He had been a person that I had found very helpful in talking about things about my faith and about my vocation. And so I sat with him and said, I have a question for you. When did you respond to the call to ministry? And he said, most recently this morning. And I did the same thing that I just heard over to my left and to your right. I giggled because I thought he was making a joke. And he said, no, seriously. I think you have to decide every day that you're going to respond to God's call to be a pastor. And I think you have to respond every day to God's call to be a disciple. And boy, that caught my attention. Because we live in a world and in a faith context in which many times we presume that it's sort of one and done. That you make the decision to follow Jesus and that decision then is made. But Jesus actually says the word in Luke's gospel here. Take up your cross daily and follow me. And so here at the beginning of a new year, when we're being intentional about things, maybe you've made resolutions about the kind of life you want to live in this new year. Maybe you're living intentionally right now about the ways in which you want to make changes in your life. My example yesterday was that I turned on the basketball game that would have been really tempting to sit in the recliner and just watch and doze through the commercials or the low points. But I actually watched that game in my bedroom so that I would be able to look through my drawers and find clothes that I no longer wear that I could just get out of there and sort of thin out my life a little bit. I hate to admit that in that process, I found a shirt that still had a tag attached to it that I had never, ever worn. And I've probably had it now for 3 or 4 years because it had gotten down at the bottom of the drawer under other stuff. So that was my cleaning out process yesterday that I would not have done probably at any other part of the year. But because it's a new year, new you, right? We're trying to do those things intentionally. Well, this is a great time for us to think about what it means to respond to that call to follow Jesus every single day. Jesus has intentionally invited us to follow him. But here's the thought that came to me as I read that passage this week. Jesus intentionally invites us to follow. But Jesus invites us to follow intentionally. Let me say that again. Jesus intentionally invites us to follow, but Jesus invites us to follow intentionally. That corresponds with the thought that I had back in October. What if we are leaving too much to chance? What if we're leaving too much to the hopes for organic or accidental growth? What if we're not being intentional enough, not only in our following Jesus as disciples, but in our invitational outlook toward the world as a congregation? So I hope what we hear in both of these passages is that there is both an individual and a corporate element to what we're hearing. We're always invited to follow Jesus as a disciple, but we're always invited to follow Jesus as disciples. Did you catch that? In the Mark passage we read together today, when those very first disciples are called, there's not sort of a linear sequence. Jesus doesn't say, Andrew, follow me. Simon, follow me. James, follow me. John, follow me. He calls them, and the reality and the amazing thing that I find is that there was never a point in time in which there was only one follower of Jesus. From the outset, Jesus invited people to follow him together. So it means a lot for you and for me to be individual followers of Jesus who are committed to taking up our cross daily. But we have to remember that we're not called to follow Jesus in a vacuum. We're called to follow Jesus together. And in our case, that means as a congregation, as a community of believers. So as we consider what it means to be intentionally invitational, and as we consider what it means intentionally to answer the invitation of Jesus Christ, I believe we have to do that both in the individual and the collective mindset. And as we think about what it means to take up a cross and follow Jesus daily, let's hear the action to which Jesus calls us there. Take up a cross and follow daily. As I mentioned in my prayer a moment ago, there are those images from later in the Gospels when Jesus is heading out to Calvary for crucifixion, in which the Gospel writers tell us that Jesus staggered and stumbled under the weight of that cross. Now, of course, we know that he had been pretty severely beaten, so it may not be any surprise to us that his physical stamina was failing. We also might associate some symbolic weight to that cross and say he's carrying the weight of the whole world and sin, so no wonder he staggers and stumbles under the weight of that cross. But I think it's important that we allow taking up a cross to follow Jesus to be something that is consequential, that requires something of us. Lots of us might have found a habit across the years of carrying a cross. You might have one in your pocket or your purse right now. And I think there's a real temptation to let this be the size of the cross that we carry. To let it be something that we carry in our lives. I would almost guarantee that when Jesus was bearing the weight of that cross, it was the biggest thing in his life at that moment. I think that's maybe what Jesus is inviting us to. With those fishermen, he didn't say, keep on fishing, but also be my follower. He invited them to drop everything, maybe even to walk away from their families to follow him. Now, I'm not suggesting today that anyone begin separation proceedings so that you can be a follower of Jesus. But what I am suggesting is that each of us allow that cross to be something that has weight in our lives, to be something that requires something of us, to be something that would be heavy to be carried. That cross of Jesus was a lot bigger than this one, clearly. The estimates of its weight vary from if Jesus were like so many condemned to crucifixion prisoners. If he were required only to carry the crossbar of the cross, that probably weighed somewhere around 100 pounds. So imagine the big bag of dog food over each shoulder. Or imagine those two big bags of concrete mix on each shoulder. Or imagine that person on your back that you're carrying piggyback. That's the weight of just the cross piece. But if he was carrying the whole cross, and some scholars interpret that as he carried his own cross to Calvary, that he's carrying like the tall part too. If that's the case, we're talking 250, 300 pounds of cross. You don't want to carry me. But that's the weight, or maybe even more than me, is the weight that Jesus is carrying. Do we allow our faith in our life of discipleship to occupy that big a space in our lives? I think that's part of the individual invitation. But the other thing is, are we making that commitment daily to let our faith be something of action? I'm blessed to have today, on this day when many Christians celebrate the baptism of Jesus Christ, a few reminders of my life of discipleship throughout my life. This is the small cup that the church in Princeton, West Virginia used for my baptism. They gave this to my parents. The story is, as I remember my baptism, that my 4.5-year-old sister held this cup, and the pastor then used the water from this cup to baptize me. The rest of that story is that my sister rolled around in the floor in front of the sanctuary before and after she held the cup. But that congregation promised to nurture my faith in ways that I don't remember, but in ways that I've invited so many other congregations across the years to nurture my faith. Then they handed off that responsibility to my home church in Abingdon, Virginia. And I'm blessed to have here, in the beautiful handwriting of Edna Castile, God rest her soul, the church secretary of Abingdon United Methodist Church, my confirmation certificate. This is from when I was not quite 11 years old. And in this confirmation certificate is my reminder of the vows that I made to follow Jesus. I want to tell you that I meant every word that I said when I was 11 years old. But I didn't fully understand what I was saying. I meant that I would follow Jesus. So what that meant to me was that I would be well behaved, that I would try not to lie, that I would be that kind of person who was nice to other people. I also am blessed to have in my hand this thin little Bible study book that my pastor invited me to participate in with a group of men from the church when I was 17 years old. I hope the young people in the balcony back there are really paying attention to this part. This was my confirmation. This was my Bible study when I was 17 years old. At this Bible study at age 17, I really grasped for the first time the meaning of grace. And I really grasped for the first time the meaning of living as a follower of Jesus Christ every day. It's the choice that we make to follow Jesus and to allow our loyalty to Jesus to be higher than our other loyalties that compete. I'm grateful that I received that invitation to actually live a life of faith, not to just try to be a good person, but to try to be that person who is intentionally doing what Jesus would do, giving my will over to Jesus Christ in my daily life. And I think it's because I participated in this Bible study that a few months later, in that Kelly Library at Emory and Henry College, I heard the voice of God calling me to this ministry. And I've tried to respond to that call of ministry every day too. That's my individual story. And it's an individual story that I live out, trying to be a follower of Jesus and trying to be a pastor every day because I'm invited to that action. I hope you'll feel invited to that action too. At the beginning of this new year, are you every day intentionally following Jesus? Have you ever intentionally responded to the invitation to follow Jesus? If you haven't, maybe today's the day. Or if you've gotten to a place where you are pretty comfortable. Sometimes as followers, we like to sit down on a bench and enjoy the view. Sometimes we like to say, man, this has been a great hike. I don't know if I want to continue to the top of the mountain. If you feel called to take your cross back up today and to follow Jesus more actively, maybe today's the day. But it's also a corporate call. It's a reminder to us that when we worship together, we shouldn't always assume that everyone in the room has already responded to a call to follow Jesus. We shouldn't assume when we gather together for Sunday school classes that everyone has responded to a call to follow Jesus. We should be people who imitate Jesus by offering that intentional invitation and by offering to each other those intentional invitations to take the next step in the journey. As a congregation, I think we need to confess that we allow this to happen organically in a variety of ways. I'm not saying this to call you out individually. I'm saying this to call out our culture. When was the last time that you invited someone to come worship with you because you thought they might need to start a journey of discipleship in the footsteps of Jesus Christ? When was the last time we reminded each other together that that's part of what we expect of each other? In fact, it's the large part of what we expect of each other. The mission of our congregation and the mission of the United Methodist Church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. If that's our mission, we can't leave it to accident. We can't leave it to organic growth. We have to be intentionally invitational. So what would it be like for you as a follower of Jesus to hear his invitation yet again, to remind yourself to be daily and intentional? What would it be like for you as a disciple of Jesus Christ to carry out the ministry of Jesus Christ and to carry out the mission of the church by intentionally inviting someone to share this journey of discipleship with you? What would it be like for us as a congregation to hold that before each other as the most important thing that we do, to be intentionally invitational in our every ministry? And not just as we invite people to come for the first time, but as we invite each other to take that next step. And we'll look at that across the next few weeks. So we're going to close worship today by singing together. And as we do, if you feel called to follow Jesus Christ for the first time, I hope you will sing about that, pray about that, think about that. If you'd like to make a commitment today, you are welcome. I'll hang up here near the front so that if you'd like someone to pray with you about that, I'll be close by. Or if you'd like to meet with me later this week, feel free. Give me a call, but respond. And if you feel called to stand up or to get up from where you have been in your life of faith, if you haven't picked up your cross daily lately, or if that cross hasn't been a big enough part of your life daily and you'd like to make a new commitment, you're welcome to today. In fact, you're invited to today. And I hope you'll RSVP to whatever the invitation is that you feel called toward. as followers of Jesus, individually and corporately, here's the invitation before us today: to be intentionally invitational. Amen.